Thanks. And sorry for the IT problems, which is always interesting at a tech conference, that IT is the hardest thing to do, but we have solved the problem, so here we go. Thanks for having me. I want to talk today about what I think is hopefully a useful analogy for how we think about the work that we are all collectively doing. And I'll get there in a second, but first I just want to say that this is my boss's boss's boss. This is Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay. And Pierre was, as you can probably imagine, a very strong advocate for Web 1.0 techno-optimism, right? Like, we were going to solve the world's problems through tech. We could create a marketplace where we could empower users and sellers online to take power and control over their own commerce, make incomes, right? There's just like an incredible vision for how we would solve the world's problems through eBay and other platforms like it early on. And that worked for a while, actually, right? We had this vision of like, move fast and break things. We will solve the problems. The faster we move, we will learn, we will iterate, and everyone will be better off. And we will move fast and break things, but it turns out we actually broke shit, right? It was not just a metaphor, things actually broke. So what happens on the end of that? I'm gonna now sort of introduce this analogy, which again, hope is instructive, and I'm not going to call out every time that this analogy actually applies to our current context. I'm hoping that you can do that for yourselves, but here we go. This is the 1956 Corvair. It was a hot car. People loved this car. Chevy sold more of this car than any other model car in the United States between 1956 and 1965. And it was, again, on the road with almost near ubiquity. Only here's the problem. This is actually what the Corvair looked like most of the time. Corvair was responsible for more road deaths than any other car, and not just because it had the most vehicles on the road, but because it had an outsized, unfortunate impact on the drivers who sat behind the wheel. This was for a whole number of reasons, which I will get into, but they were mostly identified, actually, by this guy, Ralph Nader. Before he was a 2000 election stealer, Ralph Nader wrote a book in 1965 called Unsafe at Any Speed. If you have not read this book, you should go and order it on Amazon immediately. It is worth your time. It is worth reading. In 1965, Ralph Nader wrote this book looking at all the ways that the automobile industry had essentially made a trade-off for style, looks, consumer price over safety. And so he wrote 8 chapters about this, ranging from the sporty Corvair to the coming struggle for safety. And I'll just talk about a couple of these chapters very much in brief. The first, in chapter 5, the engineers. In the engineers, Nader talks about the engineers and the Detroit automotive engineers' unwillingness to focus on road safety for fear of alienating customers by making cars too expensive. Now, Nader also pointed out, of course, that on average, the cost to the consumer for those stylistic changes was about $700 in the price of the car, while the cost of, on average, the safety features that they were embedding on that same car was about 29 cents. Again, make the parallels for yourselves. In Chapter 7, he talks about the traffic safety establishment. And here, Ralph Nader made the point that essentially, since the 1920s, drivers had become the central issue of concern for responsibility for road deaths. There was essentially no responsibility placed on automobile manufacturers. Instead, there were 3 E's: engineering, enforcement, and education, all focused on the driver. Okay, so if there was an accident, it was the driver's fault. And there was no responsibility placed on the automobile industry for safety standards, for engineering, for any other things that could have been done to protect the driver on the road. And then in the last chapter, he talks about the need for a safety establishment and regulation from government for road safety. In 1965, when Ralph Nader wrote this book, there were on average 5.05 deaths per million road miles. 52,000 approximately deaths per year on US highways. We'll come back to that number. It will be important. So, what happened? Okay, 1965, Nader writes his book. In 1966, the National Transportation Safety Board was established. First full governmental regulatory body for road and automobile safety. In 1968, you had the creation of similar types of automobile standards. In 1970, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration was created. In 73 through 76, seatbelts were mandated for the first time in consumer-facing automobiles. In 1979, crash testing was made mandatory for cars before they could be placed on the road. In 1983, the Friends Don't Let Friends Drive Drunk campaign rolled out for the first time. And in about 1987 to 1989, airbags became standard features for both drivers and passengers in cars for the very first time. So essentially between 1965, when Nader wrote his book, and 1989, 20-ish years, we had an incredible proliferation of safety features which recognized that cars had a role to play in automobile safety, right? And that it was at the interface between driver and automobile that safety could actually be established, right? Friends Don't Let Friends Drive Drunk is about drivers. Seatbelts is about cars. And safety could be created at the interface between the two. So, some people took a look at this and established some sort of thought experiments for how does safety culture actually evolve. And Ron Westrom looked at the aviation industry in particular for how this evolution actually occurs. And the first is through pathological safety concerns, right? Sorry, I'm standing in front of that. Who cares as long as we're not caught? That's the first stage of evolution of a safety culture, followed by reactive, which is safety is important to us and we'll respond when we have an accident. Next, we've got calculative, which is we have systems in place to manage hazards. Proactive, we work on the problems that we find. And lastly, generative, which is safety is how we do business around here. Pathological, the Corvair. Generative, Volvo. Right? Volvo established a competitive market position for themselves in being the safest car on the road, the car that people would want to buy for their teenage children before they went out to the prom, because if, God forbid, there were an accident, their child would not be decapitated. Right? And that became a value to the customer as well as to the automobile manufacturer. So here you have increasing informedness about the safety features, and here you also have increasing consumer trust as you move through the evolution of a safety culture. Again, I hope you're drawing the parallels for yourselves. I think you can. So what does all this imply, right? If we go back and think about that slide about the evolution of 20 plus years of safety culture for automobiles, it was a complex of both consumer-facing as well as movements as well as industry-facing kinds of interventions to build in a safety culture that would establish an interface between user and manufacturer that meant everyone was better off. And in ethical tech, we need the same sort of movement-oriented number of solutions. So first, we need norms. And Mo, who's here from Data for Democracy, knows about the Hippocratic Oath for data scientists that's being rolled out by Data for Democracy. Norms about how we do the work we do. Generative safety culture. Next, we need training. We need to teach the technologists of the future how to do this better through things like the Responsible Computer Science Challenge, which Kathy mentioned earlier, which will teach computer scientists to embed ethics in their building of code from the first day they encounter it, rather than as a separate and ancillary consideration separate from building code. We need tools. Because it turns out you can't just expect people to do ethics without giving them the tools in their hands to actually do it, which is why at Omidyar Network with the Institute for the Future, we built the Ethical OS, which is a set of checklists and questions to go through as you build a product to assess whether or not you have taken the process of discernment into play to make sure that you are doing this work of building a generative safety culture. We need movements, like the Center for Humane Technology, which is building, even though Doug hates it, apparently, which is building norms around what we expect as consumers from the tech platforms that we are using. We need infrastructure, like responsible tech marks by .everyone, and infrastructure for policy, infrastructure for advocacy, infrastructure for civil society, and we need networks, like coworker.org, which is essentially 21st century organizing, not unionized, but that thing that Doug mentioned about how do Uber drivers communicate with each other, that's the work that coworker.org is actually doing, right? So all these things together will build the ecosystem that will change us to that generative safety culture. Ultimately, what is required here is a process of discernment. And when I say a process of discernment, I have landed on this as the quote-unquote operational definition for ethics, because if we're going to try to agree on what does ethical tech look like, good luck to us all. But here's what I do think is important: a process of discernment, which means how not to regret the things you'll build. A process of consideration, reflection, and consideration that draws out the trade-offs that we are making deliberately, whether it is in the driver's safety or the automobile's styling, but that we are deliberate and thoughtful about those trade-offs as we make them. Ultimately, if we do that right and build all those tools of the system that I was mentioning, we will do this, which is to move purposefully and fix things rather than break them. Thanks.